for having me, and I'd like to echo what Hallie said. This is something very special, and it's really wonderful to be included in this event. I feel a little glib following such a serious and heartfelt piece, but unfortunately I guess I am a little glib. And what I wanted to say, I've been touring for a book called Life Sentences. It's my 14th novel, and because of it, I've been talking a lot about memory and its fallibility. And while I've been on the road talking about the book, I realized that although I like to consider myself a very down-to-earth, modest person who doesn't put myself forward in any way, I've been encouraging people to lobby for me, and this is actually something you can lobby to do. People don't realize it. But you can put people forward for the Nobel Peace Prize. And the reason I would like to be considered for this, you're going to want to think about what I'm about to say. There's going to be, I've said this, and there's always this moment where people go, oh. The reason I should get the Nobel Peace Prize is because in my family, in my household, we no longer argue when the argument turns into a battle of memory. Think about it. Think about how quickly you have to end an argument if you can no longer use your memory as the proof that you're right. Now, it wasn't easy to win this battle. It took a while. The stage was sort of set several years ago, and it was actually the day that I began gathering the string for the novel that became Life Sentences. My husband and I were on the way to opening day for the Washington Nationals. Baseball had just returned to D.C. That's where he grew up. He loved the Washington Senators when he was a kid. And he had this story that he loved to tell. When he was a kid, he loved the Washington Senators so much he smuggled a radio into school on opening day. And when he thought it was about time for the game to be winding up, he raised his hand, asked to be excused, went down to the boys' room, locked himself in a stall. You think about transistor radios in the day. Like no small thing. Had a little wire in his ear. And the player he loved above all players was Mike Epstein, for the simple reason that Mike Epstein was Jewish, the only Jewish Washington senator. So he's there in the bathroom stall, listening to the game, bottom of the ninth, bases loaded, score tied. Mike Epstein comes up to bat against Catfish Hunter. And my husband prays, "Dear God, please let Mike Epstein get a hit, and I'll be so much better about going to Hebrew school. I'll learn my Torah portion, I'll be a good book, but please, please let Mike Epstein win this game for the Senators." And as he loved to tell people, Mike Epstein hit a home run, a grand slam off Catfish Hunter to win that game. And he tells this story on our way to the ballpark, and one of his friends was there, and he said, "You know, I don't think so." I went to every opening day when we were kids. My dad had tickets. We checked. Mike Epstein has never, in the history of baseball, hit a home run on opening day. And this was like my husband's story. This was it explained the essence of him. He'd been telling it for years. And I had what is actually, borrowing very grandiosely, is that even a word? From Nabokov, the first shiver of an idea. What happens if this story that you've been telling that explains you on some level, what would you do if you found out that story was essentially false? How would you handle that? And that book became Life Sentences. And it was because I still didn't have him convinced yet that we shouldn't argue on the basis of memory. What that took was one of those really crucial, serious domestic disputes, the kind of things that put the marriage right on the brink, which was, what was written on that sweatshirt that we left in the cab in Dublin? And I said, "It said this thing," and he said, "It said that thing," and he said this, and I said that, and I said, "No, I'm right because," and I had this whole story why my memory was better, and he's like, "No, I would be right because," and we let it go. And a couple weeks later, he decided to organize all these photographs out of a shoebox, and he put them in an album. And we're flipping through it, and there's our vacation, and there we are in Ireland, and there I am in the sweatshirt, and I'm right. But let me say, I'm not going for canonization, just the Nobel Peace Prize. I pointed out that I was right. And he said, okay, fine, you're right. And I said then, and I was very serious, I said, the point isn't that I was right. I could have been just as wrong, because we were both arguing memory. All I want you to remember remember is at that moment how sure you were right. I want you to see how our memories can deceive us, how it really is possible to walk around absolutely, positively believing something that just isn't true. And what are the consequences of that? I mean, I was fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by memory in general. I'm fascinated by memoir. I read a lot of memoir. One of my all-time favorite memoirs is Truth and Beauty by Anne Patchett. I love it. It's about her friendship with the writer Lucy Greeley. Lucy Greeley had cancer as a child. It left her with a facial disfigurement that repeated surgeries in adulthood couldn't fix, and she wrote a beautiful book about it, a memoir called Autobiography of the Face. Now, as noted in the lovely introduction, I was a journalist, and I have this kind of pedantic thing. I think a memoir is nonfiction, and if I see something in quotes, I think somebody said it. But according to Anne Patchett, when people would go up to Lucy Greeley and say to her about these amazing, vivid, beautiful childhood memories, how did you remember that? How did you get all of that? How did you know all that detail? Lucy Greeley would say, with pride, according to her friend Anne Patchett, I'm a writer. I didn't remember it, I wrote it. I have been bumping my head on that passage. And I love this book. It's a beautiful book. It's a gorgeous book. It's a valuable book about writers and friendship. But for me, as a former journalist, I really have this issue with memoir. It's like there's not a little bit pregnant and there's not a little bit nonfiction. It's one or the other. And so I was very drawn to that. Finally, I'm almost always inspired by a real crime. I use the word inspired with great deliberation. I'm not ripping stuff from the headlines. I'm not sort of doing the lazy thing of, here's a story that you kind of know is true and you'll read it because you think I've got the insight. I'm interested in crimes that present thematic possibilities. And when I was a reporter in Baltimore, there was a story. I knew only what I read in the newspaper. I had no more information than anyone else. And what had happened is there was a woman who was suspected of abusing and neglecting her child. And she was put under supervision of the Department of Social Services. She was supposed to get regular visits. Something went wrong, a few visits were skipped. They go to her house after missing some visits, and her son isn't there. Her 3-year-old son isn't there. And they say to her, where's your son? She said, I'm not going to tell you. She said, where's your son? I can't tell you. Where's your son? Eventually, with an attorney at her side, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And when a judge was put in charge of the best interest of the child and said she must tell where the child was or risk contempt charges, she still didn't talk. She sat in a Baltimore jail for 7 years and never told anyone where her son was. Now, even on this brief acquaintance, you can tell I'm kind of a yacker. I tell stories. I organize my life in stories. Words are just coming out of my fingers or out of my mouth all day long. And to me, the idea of silence as a weapon, as a tool, was fascinating. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to put 2 women on a collision course. A woman more like me, a memoir writer, a yacker, a person who lives in words, goes back to Baltimore to find an old classmate who's in a very similar situation. And that's the story of life sentences. It is a story about memory and how fallible memory is. It is a story not about prison terms, but about all the stories we tell. The fact that every one of us probably has a story that we tell about ourselves that over the years, without us even realizing it, it might have become inauthentic. And what do you do on that day you find out